Hello, this is Tony Blazer back with another video for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. As you can see, I have a new sponsor. I want to thank Blinzall for coming on board to sponsor the stuff I do here. If you have a two-stroke, if you're familiar with two-strokes, and if you're not, you're watching probably the wrong channel. You probably are familiar with Blinzall. They've been producing high-quality two-stroke and racing oil since the late 50s. I love the smell of some castor oil. I always ran castor oil in my two-strokes, and Blinzall makes some of the best castor oil you can get. Definitely, if you're in the market for some two-stroke oil, give Blinzall a try. This video is going to cover one of my classic brochures. If you're familiar with the channel, you probably know I'm a huge connoisseur of classic brochures. I have hundreds of them back here. I've been collecting them since I was a little kid. Long before I had my first motorcycle, I'd go into the bike shops and get a brochure, kind of check it out. I love looking at them. There's a certain permanence to physical media that just doesn't exist on the internet. Somebody can't take down this, like they can take down a PDF of a brochure now. But if you have this physical thing, you have it for as long as it lasts. If you take good care of it, put it in a slip, it might last you 50, 100 years. Who knows? And I love being able to go back and look at these things. I use them for my classic videos I do here on the channel. I use them for the articles I write on Pulp MX. A lot of great information in these things. And for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look back at the 1981 Honda lineup. In 1981 here, Honda had quite a lineup of great machines. Well, maybe great's a bit strong. Really kind of good machines. They were certainly all new. Made a lot of important improvements in terms of design, but it took them a couple years to get some of that stuff sorted out. They added things like liquid cooling, monoshocks. This was the first year for Honda's open class bike, the CR450R. It didn't exactly hit the ground running with the best success that year, but it was an important year. Like I said, these are first steps. Everything was moving really fast in the late 70s and early 80s, and technology was changing year over year quite quickly. And 81 is really an important year. So when basically most of the manufacturers went to a monoshock design, a really, really big change. And some of the manufacturers were going to liquid cooling at this time. Major stuff was different from only a couple years before. If you're on a 2-year-old bike, really yours look like an antique compared to some of these things. Very interesting styling as well. So I think this will be an interesting one. If you like this sort of thing, check out some of the other ones I did. I just did a video on the history of the KDX 200. I've also done history of the CR80, history of the XR250, XR600, and individual reviews of several motorcycles. Now this is just going to be a broad overview. I'm just going to hit the high points of the 81 CRs. I'm not going to get into any great detail. This is not going to be an individual in-depth review like I normally do. We're just going to hit some of the high points of what they changed and what was new and what was interesting that year, which is what these brochures are good for, getting a kind of idea, hey, what do they do and how's it different from year to year. So in any case, if you like this, make sure you give it a like, share it on social media if you could, subscribe. I would, if you don't already, I would really appreciate that help. And here's the story of the 1981 Honda CR lineup. Now up front, I want to mention that this is a brochure I got off eBay. This is not one I collected. This one I believe came from the UK. Now I do have a US version as well, but actually I kind of like the UK version for this thing. The pictures are a little bit better, I think. I'll show you the US one as well, but in general I think the UK one is a little bit better. Now it is interesting to note that the UK actually got different front number plates than we did. If you can see here, it has less of the hangnail design, the snow shovel. I don't know why we got these things. They're really goofy looking. Clearly, what I guess the idea was they wanted to funnel more air to the radiators. The radiators on these 81s were very highly placed on the motorcycle, and they thought it was obviously important to keep the air going there. I mean, if you remember Yamaha, I think this year had it up on actually kind of behind the handlebar, in front of the handlebars there on the triple clamps themselves. So early on, the manufacturers weren't quite sure where to put these darn radiators, so everybody had their own idea. And in 81, Honda put theirs pretty conventionally. There were two individual radiators up on, but it was very high. Certainly, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 inches higher than you would find on a modern bike. So in order to get more air to the radiators, they put this strange hangnail one here on the US versions, and the UK got a much more understated, more normal looking, although still not attractive. I'm not sure why they didn't just go with a normal one and put like a mesh or some kind of a vent built into it. I mean, clearly plenty of people reinvented number plates and it would have been fine, but in 81 Honda went with this really odd design that I don't think anybody was much cared for. Visually speaking, the 1981 CR80R is the least changed of all the machines for 1981. It looks almost exactly the same as it did the year before. The bike is actually pretty strongly changed. There's quite a bit they changed in year to year. 80 was the first year for the CR80R, and the 81 they added longer travel front and rear. They changed the motor around, the power band, brought the power band down into the low end a good bit more. The 80 model had been very fast, but kind of hard to ride, kind of intimidating for kids. Suspension wasn't very good either, although I won't say this 81 was much better in that realm. The Honda CRs had some Pretty dicey reputation for suspension performance. The Showa components weren't considered great even on the big bikes in the late 70s, early 80s, but this 81, it was, certainly better than the year before, but not the best Mini in the class by any means. While they did make some significant upgrades to the 80 in 1981, by far the biggest changes were on the full-size bikes. The 125, 250, and all-new CR450 were completely new from the ground up. They shared not a single part with the outgoing models, and in the case of the 450, there was no outgoing model. This was the first year for Honda's open bike at all. Now, the 125 featured Kayaba suspension this year, and that was a change because typically Honda, in fact, this might have been the first year they ever did that because Honda actually was a part owner in Showa, so they'd always featured Showa components. Not to any great renown, though. The Showa stuff on the CRs was known for being pretty terrible year in and year out. For 1981, they went with Kayaba components that had a set of 38mm Kayaba forks up front and a all-new single shock in the back using Honda's all-new ProLink rear suspension system. Now, the ProLink used a bottom link rising rate linkage mounted to a large single shock with a remote reservoir off to the side. Now, unlike a modern system, there wasn't a lot of adjustability built into the first generation of the ProLink. The only external adjustment was for preload and rebound damping. There was no adjustment for compression damping available. This initial shock was pretty decent, I guess, if you're not really fast. It was known for being pretty plush initially, but the rising rate, they didn't quite get right this first year, and it kind of blew through the stroke on hard hits. People didn't care for the reliability either. They tended to blast the remote reservoir hose would come off the shock, which definitely was not good. You'd lose all your nitrogen and stuff when that would happen. So that was not a winner. They also had problems with this new massive alloy swing arm, which looked very trick. Braking, they tended to crack. Frames also cracked. They had some issues with the transmission gears. Basically in 81, pretty much all the full-size bikes had some reliability issues. They really renovated them completely from the ground up, and some of that stuff took a little while to work out the bugs on. The all-new liquid cooling system, as I said earlier, featured a dual radiator design. It was mounted pretty high, though, up on the tank. A lot of people did not care for the ergonomics as well. The seat and tank relationship and the handlebars and what have you were kind of weird. A lot of people said they could feel the weight up high on the chassis. Got to remember, most of the air-cooled bikes were significantly lighter than this bike. This bike was pretty heavy in 1981, so it took a little while to get the weight down and get everything sorted out in these liquid cooling systems. It is also interesting to notice that the 125, as I said, gets 38mm forks, while the larger bikes got 41. So at this point in time, a 125 would not get all the latest technology. The front brake is a single leading shoe design, where the 250 and the 450 got the more powerful dual leading shoe design, smaller suspension. Even though the 125s were one of their best-selling bikes, they still weren't thought of as being on par in terms of performance and with the larger bikes. It would take a few years before the 125 started getting treated basically the same way, and eventually the 500s would be the ones that are getting neglected. But this first year 81 certainly was a big change. It didn't turn out to be the best bike in 81 by any means, but definitely a step forward in terms of technology with adding the liquid cooling and the monoshock rear suspension. On the 250 side, the CR450R was also brand new for 1981. It had all new suspension. It used a version of the ProLink rear end. The shock was different on the 250. The forks were also larger. They were 41mm versus the 38s on the CR125. Also got the liquid cooling treatment for 1981, although again the design was very similar but a little bit different to accommodate the larger motor. The motor itself was pretty potent this year. The 246cc motor actually had a good bit of power, but the bike was very overweight. When Dirt Bike tested it, it came in at a whopping 240 pounds. Which is almost 20 pounds more than a modern 450 4-stroke KTM with electric start. Think about that one for a second. This thing was heavier than a lot of open bikes in 1981. It just really was a portly pig. There was also reliability issues. The transmission, the clutch in particular, was pretty poor this year. Like I said, they reinvented everything, redesigned everything. Some of the stuff needed a little sorting out, though. The bike would creep in gear when you put it in gear. It would also, the clutch would heat up and slip. It was not a great setup this first year. The bike, like I said, was pretty potent. It had a good power band in terms of potency. It was kind of a mid-range motor, good get up and go, but it was a little bit difficult to modulate, and the bike hit really hard but didn't pull really far. So a lot of people said it was a more fun bike to ride than it was to race, if you know what that means. Overall, like I said, it was a a real big transition year for Honda. Roger DeCoster was just moving over from the race team to R&D, and it would take him a year or two to get things sorted out. The 82s would be much better than these 81s, and then by 83, Honda would be on top. They'd have the best bikes pretty much in every class. So this 81, was a first baby step towards that. Definitely broke a lot of new ground in terms of technology, but they just did not have it quite sorted out yet. Of all the machines of 1981, by far the most disappointing was the CR450R. This is based largely on the fact that there was a huge amount of anticipation about this motorcycle. Honda had been racing open class machines both in the US and Europe for many years at this point, but had not as yet produced a production 450. And you have to keep in mind too, at this time, the open class is still considered the premier class. Again, 10 years from now, or 10 years from this, they would kind of start neglecting the 500s. But in 1981, the 500 was still considered like the premier motorcycle. So Honda this year, instead of taking a all-new engine designed to be like an open classer from the ground up, they chose to take one of their smaller engines, basically modify the 1980 CR450 air-cooled motor, and bore and stroke it into 431 cc's. Now what this meant was the 81 had a 4-speed transmission, a light flywheel, and a very kind of narrow power band. It wasn't like a chugger in the sense of like a Mako 490 or something. It was much more of a powerful 250 in terms of how it ran. Now, depending on your skill level, that might not be too big of a deal, but most average riders found this bike to be a little tough to control and a little difficult to ride. The suspension was not great, much like it was on the 250 and the 125. That certainly didn't help matters. The bike had a weak clutch. The 4-speed transmission was gappy. It also meant that the bike was, no good for anything other than motocross, really. Without a decent low first gear off-road, it was going to be kind of hairball to try and slip the clutch, and the clutch wasn't up for that kind of abuse. Pretty much this bike was disappointing all around. It has made many top 10 lists of the worst motorcycles ever built. Certainly one of Honda's worst motorcycles ever. The bike, like I said, was unreliable. There were all kinds of issues with cracking frame, cracking rear swing arms. They also had the same problem with the shock, tended to be pretty unreliable. It would like to blow the reservoir off. It was overall, I guess an important bike, and that it got things started in the open class, but this first effort was definitely not one of Honda's best. I think it's kind of a collectible bike now because it is the first year. It certainly looks cool. I love the looks. I love those red motors. I was kind of sad they went away from that. That's definitely gives it a unique look. It's a beautiful motorcycle. It just didn't really perform that well. Much like the rest of the 81s, kind of a big step forward in technology, a really tiny step, maybe a step backwards in terms of performance from 80. The old DualShock motors, the DualShock bikes might have actually been better than these 81s in a lot of ways. The 450 wasn't quite as ponderously overweight as the 250 was in relation to its competitors, but it was certainly no lightweight. I think most people found the bike pretty mediocre overall. So definitely needed to wait a year or two to get the CR4. The new CR480 in 1982, though, would finally kind of bring Honda into the limelight of one of the best open class bikes available. So there you have it. That's my look back at the 1981 motocross lineup. Certainly a bunch of important machines for Honda. Even though they weren't the best bikes in their class in any division, they certainly had a major effect in terms of the technology moving forward. The Honda ProLink design, which debuted this year, is still basically more or less the default design all the manufacturers use now. They got that pretty right on the first try in terms of the design. The liquid cooling, certainly that's common. They would eventually go with much lower radiators than this. This 81 with the weird front number plate and stuff was maybe not the best choice, but overall these were interesting bikes. Certainly very colorful bikes. To my eye, beautiful except for that funky front number plate. Interesting machines and well regarded in terms of collectability, I think, by most people. I would love to have an 81 now. Like I said, back then they weren't the best. My brother-in-law had an 81 CR250 and my best buddy too, and I didn't care for the performance of the bike at the time. Didn't much like the thing, but now I'd love to have it just for the collectability of it. So interesting motorcycles to be sure. So if you like this sort of thing, make sure you check out some of the other videos I've done on the channel. Just did a retrospective on the KDX200. If you're a Honda fan, I've also looked back at the Honda XR250, the Honda CR80, and I did a history of the iconic Honda ATC 250R as well. And I'll add a couple links to those videos here in the description and also at the end of the video. So anyway, thanks for watching. This is Tony Blazer. Keep the rubber side down.